Well, I've got to say, this timing of this class is a challenge, isn't it? Sometimes we don't get here till 10:25, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to abbreviate what I prepared. And this morning we're here at 9:45, so get a chance to get to know each other a little, I guess. But I like to hold off until 10:10 because there are people who come in just for the class. So to start early would not honor their efforts. So you can count down with me as we wait. I got 10:09 and 15 seconds on my clock. Yes, Lions. There you go. There you go. Clearly you were sitting next to the right person in the pew there. No, that was an excellent sermon. It was kind of fun. I hope for you it was fun to listen to, having already kind of gone through some of that stuff. She gave Adam more credit than I did, but that's something Kathy would do. Okay, so a little bit of what are we going to do we got this session and 3 after that before I take off to Maine and you're just a pleasant memory. So what I'm going to do is dedicate those 4 sessions to Abraham. I've been saying all along we're leading to Abraham, that it was through Abraham that God established this new way of being. So we're going to kind of skip over the Tower of Babel, or Babel, if you will, which is interesting and fun and related maybe to Pentecost, but I think you know that story. And I'm going to skip over and miss Joseph, which is my favorite story in the Bible. I may hold an evening class in the fall just on the Joseph story. But I do want you to get Abraham because that's the core of it, I think. So, this morning, the education of Father Abraham. We'll start with our prayer. God, by whom the meek are guided in judgment, and light rises up in darkness for the godly, grant us in all our doubts and uncertainties the grace to ask what you would have us do, that the spirit of wisdom may save us from all false choices, and that in your light we may see light, and in your straight path we may not stumble. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. What's the question we're answering? How should we live? Being real about who we are and aspiring to be like God. What have we learned so far? We've learned that God created the world and called his creation very good, but it seems that man has a task, if you will, to grow, to be more like God. We learned in the second creation story that we have a desire to, I think a God-given desire, as we've discussed it here, to learn and grow and know. And that manifests itself in the story of Adam and Eve by eating of the fruit of the tree of good and evil and thereby gaining some ability to distinguish differences, but also a sense of self-consciousness, which can be used for good or it can be used for bad. In Cain and Abel, we learned what bad looks like as one brother turns on the other, and the reasons for that and the consequences of that are carrying forth. And then we had the story of Noah, which right before that I offered what might be called a third creation story, where we see the line of Cain trying to be heroic, as the Bible describes heroes, in the line of Seth trying to be faithful, as the Bible describes saints, and we get to the story of Noah. And I concluded the telling of the story of Noah by saying that the way of nature must be replaced by the way of law. So I hope you can see a theme emerging. Creation is very good, but humankind can't live just all by itself. It has to constrain its desires. It has to guide and orient its purposes, and law is the way that we do that. That's what law is. So I want to start with this quote from the author of this book, Leon Cass. Is it Cass? Cass? Anyway, neither marriage nor fatherhood, neither family nor nation can become truly what they are and should be unless they are steadily oriented toward and faithfully dedicated to something higher than themselves. Makes sense? If I had to sum up everything I think we've discussed through Genesis at this point, this sentence would do it. None of the institutions that we hold dear, none of the relationships that we think our life is really premised upon and grows through can be what they should be unless we're oriented and dedicated to something higher than ourselves. All right? So, who is Abraham? Abraham, one of the patriarchs, one of the fathers, is yet another individual that we study in the Bible. We sing about him in our church schools and nursery schools growing up, and we recite his name all the time. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Just one of those guys. But I want to suggest that in Abraham is really the introduction of a different way of being related to God, a different way of living life, and that it's not just personal and private. We struggle, I think, in our discussions now about religion as to whether it has a public manifestation or whether it's simply private. Is it something that we should do in the quiet of our own rooms, and whatever goodness that generates in us will manifest itself in secular behavior, or is it something that we go out and treat as a more public thing? Which is even more interesting when you get into a society that's largely got a lot of secular influences. It may just be secular. I don't want to get into the debate about whether a Christian nation or not, but it's hard not to argue we're not a pluralistic nation, and that a lot of the ethics that may have grown up through Christianity are now thought of as being secular. Many of our children's generation thinks that reason can get you to where we are, and that Christianity was just a superstitious deviation along the way, and thank God we're over with that fantasy. I would take dispute with that, but that's another class. But I think here it's important to think about, is this just private? Is it just for me? Is it just for my family? Or are the lessons we learn through how to live through Abraham and the covenant something that apply to everyone? Secondly, it's not just personal. It's not just about individuals. It's also about nation states. You'll see that as we go through the story of Abraham, we're not just talking about Abraham and his family and his efforts to raise his kid the right way. It is instead how he deals with people that are invading, how he deals with people that are in the land, how he deals with people in the family that don't work out right? So it's about organizing a society as well as organizing an individual. It's all of that. It is all of that. So we start in the 11th chapter of Genesis, and I'll just read it quickly. And Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram. You'll remember that Abram becomes Abraham later. Nahor and Haran. Now these were the generations of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran begat Lot. You remember Lot? And Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the hand of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees, which you know by the name of Babylon. So notice that Lot and Abraham are related to each other, right? Lot and Abraham are related to each other. So what happens to Abram then? So Abram is visited by God. Tehran has already started this journey, leaving his home and started out. Abraham is visited by God, and the Lord said to Abram, "Go thee forth from thy land." I love the older translations when we start talking about the Old Testament in particular. "Go thee forth from thy land and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into the land that I will show thee." So you're on the move, and you're going to continue being on the move. You are a pilgrim. You are a traveler. "And I will make of thee a great nation." He's got Abram's attention now, doesn't he? "I will bless thee. I will make thy name great, and be thou a blessing." You are blessed to be a blessing. "And I will bless those that bless thee. And in thee all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So I was arguing in the story of Noah that you had a covenant that had universal application. These were things that all people were to abide by. And now, in the covenant God is going to make with Abraham, it's still of universal application, but notice how it's to one person, one family. I'm worried about everybody, but you're the one I'm focused on. You're the one that abides by this covenant. So what did Abraham do in response to all this? He said, yes. So Abraham went as the Lord had spoken to him right away. No packing, no delay. Boom, he's out. So let's look at this again. Go thee forth from thy land. So give it all up and move forward. Leave your family behind, leave your house behind. There's a new land I'm going to show you. I will make of thee a great nation. I'll bless thee, make thy name great. You'll be a blessing. All those who bless you, I will bless. And through you, all the peoples of the earth will in fact be blessed. So I have a question for you. Why does Abraham obey God's command? Why? Is it out of obedience or ambition? Is it out of obedience or ambition? God has spoken. I've heard the voice. I'm hungry for God and inner relationship with God and how to draw closer to God. And if God says do it, I'm going to do it. Or, hey, that sounds good. More land, more power, more fame, more privilege. I'll do it. In fact, I'm so motivated, I'm going to do it right now. I don't need to pack because there's going to be better bags where I'm going. Which do you think motivated Abraham? Can we get a microphone over here? Diane, the voice of wisdom.
I just think both. Why can't it be both?
Okay. In equal measure? Which do you think came first?
Well, because we aren't told that he had the faith before. I mean, yeah, that sounds good, and this comes with it. So, I think he grew into the God.
Yeah, grew into that God.
Yeah.
The great thing about this question, as Diane just said, is we're not told all of it. So, we don't know the answer, which means you can have any answer you want. But I do want you to think about that. What do you think? Which one would motivate you? Which one would motivate your neighbor? Which one's the stronger motivation?
Was Abram not chosen? For if he was chosen, wouldn't he choose A rather than B? Wouldn't that be the natural instinct of him?
Nice. So define chosen for me.
A special ambassador of God.
Okay.
Chosen in as much as he was visited by God.
All right, so to press on the question a little bit, chosen in that God said, I'm going to talk to him, or chosen in that he was created specially for this purpose?
You're stretching beyond my capabilities, George.
No worries, no worries. Have you guys ever watched the Dune movies? Anybody watch the Dune movies? Where the protagonist, who's to me clearly a Christ figure, and he winds up going from this planet of clearly paradise, to me, it looks a lot like Scotland or Ireland, so paradise. And he winds up on a desert planet, but somehow he knows the ways of the desert. And people are going, he's fulfilled the prophecy. He just knows. He just knows what to do, somehow instinctively. Anyway, if you hadn't seen Dune, it's worth coming to this class just for that recommendation. All right, let's see what else.
George, I think the scary thing about that question you're asking is it forces us to ask the question, what's our motivation? Because the answer to that question is more, since we don't know, you start to ask that question, well, what would be my motivation? And that gets to a scary place because you're not sure where it is. So I would pose to you that it's the beginning of Abram's journey. So it's probably a little bit more B that he grows into A as he becomes more godlike. Hence the nature of this class you're asking us to do.
Yeah. That's a good thought. That's a good thought. All right, Randy, but go ahead and give her the mic now. Thank you.
I would like to think it's the power of the message and the messenger, so there really wasn't a choice.
power of the message and the messenger. Yeah, I like that. I like that. Okay.
It tells us several times in the Bible, it's mentioned that we are chosen. And I think it's in the Psalms that says that we are chosen even before we are formed. So that, to me, says that God knows who we are ahead of time. And I think that he knew that Abraham, the kind of person that he was, and I think that he wanted somebody that was going to be cooperative, and he chose Abraham ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because we are told constantly in the Bible, you're chosen beforehand.
Right. I knew you before you were born in your mother's womb. Would he have chosen? Go ahead.
So you said, why does Abraham obey God's command?
No. I just said, did he obey God's command out of obedience or ambition?
Okay, but up there it says, why does Abraham obey God's command?
Okay, fair enough. Go ahead.
Why not obey God's command? What does he have to lose by obeying God's command?
Everything.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
You mean leaving his family and land and so forth?
Everything, his life as he knows it, is to be left. Without any sense of where he's going. He's never been there before. What he's going to get, he doesn't know what a blessing looks like.
Well, maybe he did it out of adventure then, a sense of adventure.
He had maybe he had a sense of adventure. Yeah. Yeah. All right.
I'm wondering whether or not God's absolutely sure of what Abram's motivation is, because he gives him a pretty good quest later on to answer that question.
Yeah, he's come back repeatedly. That's an excellent point.
If he's 25 years old, it's B. If he's 55 years old, it's A.
Yeah, there you go. Well said. Richard Rohr agrees with you. Yeah.
I think it's a little like a Field of Dreams. If somebody's voice came to me and said, build it and he will come, I'd be scared just hearing that and then respond, I'd better build it, and then I have the faith that I'm plowing up all my crop.
Yeah. No, good point. The message itself is compelling. All right, yes.
I feel like God was almost doing a sales job on him, like a carrot on the stick, almost like he knew that he better trickle it with some enticement to get him to move and, as you say, leave everything.
Yeah.
He needed a little bit of what's on the other side.
So hold that thought. We're going to come back to that. There are a lot of carrots at the beginning and almost none at the end. So we don't have time to answer this question. Well, after Robert speaks, yes.
What I'm thinking about, relating it back to all that's come before in this class, where basically the Garden of Eden is freeing man to quest, to learn, to grow. I think it comes directly out of that. I think we're, by nature, we love to quest and to learn and to grow. And so it's more B.
Yeah, thank you. And so anybody else want to make a quick comment before I move on? I don't mean to lose you. Yeah.
I'll try to be brief. Thanks. Everything that I do EFM, which I really enjoy and recommend to people doing, and I really believe that God is constantly trying to understand us and guide us. And I know that, God is all-knowing and all that, but I think this fits in. I mean, to me, this is, did he ask his son, did he ask Christ, would you do all this? It's that same thing in some way. Mm-hmm. And so I just believe this is another very good example of God's love for us. He's trying to figure out a way to communicate, is what I find so loving about God, is that he's always is reaching out.
Nice. Kind of like Peter on the beach with Peter. I said Peter, Jesus on the beach with Peter. Yeah, thank you. So we don't have time to answer this question, but I want you to think about it. If you were God, would you have chosen him if he didn't have ambition? Would you have chosen if he didn't have ambition? Okay, let's look at the shape of his journey. There are 11 moments that I want to describe, which means we're going to have to go through them pretty fast. You're free to ask clarifying questions, but I would ask you not to comment on them or ask deeper questions, because each one is a class and we could get engaged in a wonderful conversation very quickly. But if it doesn't make sense to you, ask a clarifying question. Is that clear? Okay. So the first we've already done. It's the original call. Abraham is called with a command and a promise, and he answers that call, as we've already said. The second one is there's a famine in the land once he gets to Canaan. John, you asked what is he leaving behind? Well, security is one of the things he left behind, and that gets challenged almost right away. So what does he do? He does what people do when there are famines. He goes to Egypt. This won't be the first generation that goes to Egypt. And then the Lord goes to Egypt because Sarah gets taken by the Pharaoh once they get there. There's this continuing theme there where Abraham and Sarah are under threat, and for whatever reason, Abraham tells the threatening person that Sarah is his sister and not his wife, which seems to give them freedom to take her. So the Pharaoh does that, and God intervenes. And God sends plagues to rescue Sarah. Does this sound familiar? God sends plagues to Egypt to rescue Sarah. And then Abraham acquires all kinds of wealth, maybe speaking to his ambition. Lot's with him, by the way. He gets really wealthy, Lot does not. And he returns to Bethel, a wealthy man, Bethel being the place that he came from. And that creates some tension between he and Lot, right? Because he's got this new status, and Lot does not. Second moment. Third moment. The tension becomes unbearable, so Abraham decides they need to part ways, and he lets Lot choose which land Lot wants, right? He lets Lot choose which land Lot wants. Now, if it had been me, I'd have made you split the thing into two, and then I'd have chosen which one I wanted. But no, Abraham gives Lot control over where he wants to go. So he goes into the plain. He goes into the fertile plain and the rich cities, we're told, that are already there, Sodom and Gomorrah. But the Lord goes to Abraham and says, don't worry about all of this, because one day it's all going to be yours and your descendants. So they have separated. The family has had its internal tensions, and they have gone their separate ways. But Lot's going to run into trouble because he gets into the middle of a war between the Canaanite kings, those who are in Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Babylonian invaders. Babylon is always lurking there. See, right from the beginning, we've got Babylon and Egypt. They're going to continue to play a role right on along, as they do today, by the way. And so Abraham, who turns out to be his brother's keeper, remember the question, am I my brother's keeper? Abraham says, yes, I am. Rescues Lot from the invading kings, but refuses to take the victor's spoils of war. Spoils that, let's assume, it would have been assumed he had a right to take, but he doesn't. He leaves them there for Lot. So basically, he goes in, saves Lot, restores Lot, and extracts no price for it. Along the way, though, Sarah has not yet had a child, shades of Henry VIII perhaps, but she gives him the right to make Hagar a mother, her Egyptian servant, really. So Hagar winds up becoming pregnant, and then Hagar disrespects Sarah. Sarah doesn't really appreciate being disrespected, and so Sarah goes to Abraham and says, banish Hagar, which he does. And the Lord, by the way, says, do what Sarah says. Do what Sarah says. But once he banishes Hagar, then the Lord goes around and takes care of Hagar once she's out of the house. So he kind of takes care of it all. So she comes back, and Ishmael is born. So Ishmael is a son of Hagar, the servant, but now the heir. So Abraham finally has an heir. Up to this point, all these promises of future generations taking over and great nations finding their lineage back to you have proven specious because there's no heir. There's no line for that. All right. But then in the midpoint of the story, remember I said there were 11 moments. Well, often in the Bible, the middle thing is the most important. It's called a chiastic structure. So you will lead to the middle, a major point is made, and then you move away from the middle. So the sixth moment is the middle. We've had these moments that led to it. And in the middle of the story, God comes to Abraham and says famously, "Walk before me and be wholehearted." Where have you heard that term wholehearted before? Think about it when we say the confession next time. Walk before me and be wholehearted. And God promises that Sarah will give birth to a son. Isaac, we know, is coming along the way. Abraham changes his name here from Aram to Abraham to signify, I think, his new relationship with God. You know, I've told you before, still happens in monastic life where you go into the monastery, but upon taking your final vows, I suppose, you are given a new name. Or Pope Francis, right, who upon his ascendancy to being Pope gets a new name. You have a new name with God. So Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah. And then he's got to accept the covenant. He may have been chosen, but as you guys have already noted, he's got his own free will, so he has to accept the covenant, which he does through the mark of circumcision. Now, this is going to play a role for a long time. Remember, Peter and Paul are going to fight about circumcision later. And however old Abraham is at this point, he's not 10 days. And it's not just him, it is everyone. So this is a commitment, right? This is a commitment to this covenant, a way of marking yourself as being God's own. So what happens after that covenant is articulated, after it is accepted, after they are marked as God's own? Then the Lord tests Abraham, right? So up to this point, he's called Abraham. Then he's articulated the covenant, and Abraham signs up for all of it, all of it. I've told you guys a story about doing the Lamastad. We used to, still do actually, Lamastad is an afternoon tutoring program we run here at the church. The kids all come from parents who speak Spanish but not English. Sometimes they're fluent in English, sometimes not. But there's nobody to help them with their homework because they're going to English schools. So we teach them godly play. And those of you who know godly play know that there are wondering questions. It's a core part of the curriculum. So you tell the story, and then you wonder. I wonder what is the most important part of the story. I wonder what part of the story could be left out. What's your favorite part of the story? These kids are great. So invariably, when I was teaching them, you'd ask them what the favorite part of the story is, and a hand would shoot up and then start to wiggle around. And pretty soon energy is almost levitating this young child's body. And she would say, all of it, all of it. And then you go, oh, and you just say thank you. You don't comment on that. So I go to the next child. It will be all of it except louder. And then there's more wriggling and more hand raising, and that was the answer, all of it. It's my favorite part, all of it. So Abraham has all of it, right? But the Lord tests him. How does he test him? When he gets back to where he's going, back to the altar that he has built, remember the three angels that come? Now this is Rublev's icon, this 12th century icon by a Russian monk, characterizing the scene of the three strangers at the Oaks of Marm as what? The Eucharist, right? So in the Old Testament, there are three strangers, but in Rublev's imagination, who is it? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And what you can't See this box right here? This little rectangle? So it's believed that that was a mirror in the original icon. So that when you pray to that icon, which you do by standing in front of it and gazing at it in a particular way, you would see yourself. See what's happening? So you're sitting at the table with the Trinity in your meditations. So again, just an artist imaginally connecting these themes between the testaments and over time. So Abraham sends these three strangers, and God does, and Abraham treats them justly. He offers hospitality. God comes, they confirm that he's going to have a son. Lot's not going to do as well, is he? Strangers are going to go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and what's going to happen there? We all know this story because, well, one of the reasons we know this story is it was a common reference when we were fighting what the dean calls the pelvic issues, right? Because there's a sense of some in that story that it addresses homosexuality. But the truth is, what Lot says is, don't rape the visitors. You can have my daughters instead. Hardly, in my view, an ethical prescription that we want to follow today, right? So Lot really doesn't handle this challenge as well as Abraham handles this challenge. So what happens next? Well, Abraham, remember what he did last time Lot got in trouble? So this time it's not Babylonian kings he has to fight, but God, who wants to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah as punishment, or if you will, the consequences of this immoral behavior and lack of hospitality, which is a big deal. And what does Abraham do? He argues, you're going to destroy the whole city because 50 guys were a problem? And he and God negotiate how many good people God has to find there in order not to destroy the city. Finally, I think they get down to 5. But he can't find 5, so the city burns. But the point is, Abraham challenges God. Did you ever see the movie The Saint with Robert De Niro? He's like a country preacher in, Louisiana or somewhere, and he winds up, the opening part of the movie is him going to a car accident on the side of the road, and the victim of the car accident dies, and he can't save her. And he winds up all night long screaming and yelling at God. He's a preacher, just angry. Why did you do this? What's the point? There's no saving grace here. Who are you anyway? I think it's a tried and true tradition to have honest conversations with God, so that anger with God, questioning, doubt are part and parcel of our relationship with God and always have been. Then there's this other issue that lurks around from time to time. Does God change God's mind? Right? Lyons kind of got to this in your earlier comment. And here he's negotiating with Abraham. Did he change his mind, or is he just playing with him? I don't know. I'd like to think that Abraham was having some impact on what might happen by taking a just stance, trying to protect these people. At the end of the day, he's unable to do so, and he accepts the need to do what has to be done. Then Abraham winds up wandering off into the land of the Philistines, and again, Sarah is taken by a king, this time by Abimelech, whose name we know from other scriptural stories. And again, God intervenes and saves Sarah. And then we have another moment with Hagar and Ishmael, where Sarah wants to banish them, so Abraham, I got it wrong actually. The first time around, Hagar gets upset and leaves, and God brings her back. This time around, Sarah's done with her and wants her banished, and God says, listen to Sarah. That's an important distinction. God tells Abraham to obey Sarah, and then he goes and intervenes again to rescue Ishmael, promising that he will make them a great nation too, right? That God will make Hagar and Ishmael a great nation as well. It can't be part of this, but you can be part of something that's your own. So in each case, God takes care of them. Yeah.
Just to clarify that. So he tells Ishmael he'll make a great nation under Ishmael, but it's not the covenant. But it's not based on the same covenant.
Not going to be based on, well, I don't know what he said about that, but it's not going to be part of the Abrahamic line.
Okay.
Right? right? So I would say, yeah, it's not going to be that covenant. You may have your own covenant, but it won't be that covenant, right? But just, okay. So all of this is coming. I hope you can see that we're moving to that midpoint, these things that are happening in God's presence. There are a lot of carrots in those first 4 or 5 moments where God's saying, it'll be okay. I'm going to renew the promise. Actually, I'm going to sweeten it a little bit. Then you get to that midpoint, and then it gets harder, right? Abraham says yes, and then God starts testing. Well, what about hospitality? Well, will you take care of Lot? Well, what are you going to do about Hagar? And then what happens in the end? The binding of Isaac. So after all of this worry about whether he would have a son or not, after all of this confusion and anxiety about whether God's promises would actually come to fruition, the one thing that Abraham needs is Isaac. Isaac is the heir. Isaac is the holder of the line. Without Isaac, there is nothing. And what happens? God tells him to sacrifice Isaac. So Abraham takes Isaac up to the top of the mountain, binds him, and prepares to execute the sacrifice. At the last minute, God intervenes and says, no, take the ram. And there we have this kind of horrible story. But what do we hear? What do we see in Abraham about that story? So put aside child sacrifice for a moment. Different time, different purpose. Quick little footnote, child sacrifice probably pretty rampant at the time. This is thought by many to be a story that puts an end to child sacrifice, rather than a desire of God that the child be sacrificed. So put that aside, but what do we learn about Abraham? Or if you will, why does Abraham obey God's command? Obedience or ambition?
George, can I ask you a question first?
Yes, sir.
Doesn't Ishmael have some special significance in the Islamic faith?
There are some thoughts that that's the beginning of Islam, Ishmael. And I don't know anything about Islam, to be honest with you, so I don't know if they think their roots go there or not. Does anybody else know with any sense? Okay.
Wait for the mic.
Yeah. Sorry, thank you.
I've had Muslims that have told me that Ishmael was the sacrifice.
And that's it. That's what I was too.
Instead of Isaac.
Right, right. There you go. Yes, good question. You don't have to, you're welcome to offer answers to the questions, but you don't have to. But I want you to go back and remember how you were feeling about answering the question the first time with obedience and ambition. And then now that you know this whole story and you're seeing the binding of Isaac and where Abraham is in his relationship with God, is it obedience or ambition? I mean, there's no room for ambition at this point, right? Yeah, go ahead.
It just puts me in mind of a hymn from way back. Is your all on the altar, a sacrifice laid? And I think this story tells us what God wants from us. Because as you said, Isaac was everything that Abraham wanted and had been promised and had, but God was asking him to give everything that he wanted, just as you said, to sacrifice that. And of course, we know from the rest of the story that his relationship with God was that much richer because he was willing to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And who else winds up having to give up everything? Jesus winds up having to give up everything, right?
George, doesn't this become a theme throughout the Old Testament of everyone's relationship to God? I'm thinking about Job, I'm thinking of different Isaiah, different characters in the Old Testament who start out with a command from God that has the carrot, but then as their life story is told in the Old Testament, they ultimately get to this place where it's no longer about the carrot. It's about because he said so.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is a clarifying question, but has anyone ever posited, or have you ever heard anyone posit, when a few slides back you were talking about the three people who appear, I can't remember how they were phrased. There were three traveling strangers.
Three
So it makes me think that that is an appearance of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I also wonder, is it possible, has anyone ever posited that those are the three strangers that visit the Christ child?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'm not aware of it. The traditions, the three wise men are not actually named in Scripture. The traditions that explain who they are and where they came from don't make that connection, but I don't know. Anybody else have any? I don't know. I've never seen it, but that doesn't mean somebody didn't.
I don't mean to be kind of science fiction, but it does make sense to me that why wouldn't they visit? Why wouldn't they come and observe together what was happening?
Yeah. 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 You can see a parallel there. Well, this is kind of, what Kathy said in her sermon. Whether it's scientifically verifiable or historically accurate doesn't change the fact that it's true, right? And we can affirm its truth by finding those patterns in our own lives. And so doing that, you've just done that, and you can find it in your own lives, and here motivates our hospitality. So thank you, Lyons. That was a good point. All right. So what did we learn there? This is this seminal moment where the covenant is articulated. It is, I'm trying to say, a natural outgrowth of the theme of Genesis since the creation stories. We find that the first and the last adventures, if you will, where Abraham goes in response to God's call, there's that response. We've wondered about the motivation for that response, but whatever you think the role that ambition plays, it seems clear to me that the obedience grows. The desire to be obedient, the commitment to be obedient, and the actual being of obedient grows through his education, through these other steps. He wouldn't have done that in step one, I don't think. So all of God's promises, all the carrots and all the sticks that are there are, I'm arguing, and Cass argues, part of his education, right? Part of his education that leads him to this point of obedience. Maybe at the beginning there was some notion of ambition or reframed ambition. I'm not against ambition. But in the end, it's clear that it's all obedience because his ambitions are about to be sacrificed. And in fact, I'm arguing that the point of the story is his ambitions are to be sacrificed. That's what he thinks is happening. But then there are other parallels, right, with Sarah and Lot as we went through those moments where he's dealing with them in different ways. So the point is that I think there's a coherent story there told through these 11 adventures. And I think we see Abraham growing in his sense of himself and his sense of how to go through the world. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy to do that, right? And I'm struck in reading this story and putting that down and then picking up the newspaper, how much of what Abraham is wrestling with is the same thing that's being wrestled with in the Middle East today. Babylon is now Iran in the eyes of some. Egypt is still Egypt. There's still, when Abraham comes to the land that he's been called to, what? There are people there already. So how does he settle into it? How do his people settle into it? How do you deal with that? There's an excellent book called My Promised Land, written by an Israeli journalist, Ari Shavit, S-H-A-V-I-T, called The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. So he's Israeli, and he is really writing from that perspective. So good to remember. But he says this, which I just found really helpful. So I'm going to read it to you in the context of both what we've studied about Abraham and what you're reading in the newspapers. He says, "Only a few years ago did it suddenly dawn on me that my existential fear," so he spent the last 20 pages talking about how he's always afraid of threats, "how my existential fear regarding my nation's future and my moral outrage regarding my nation's occupation policy," that is, how they're dealing with the other people that are in that land, "are not unconnected." So fear and occupation policy are not unconnected. On the one hand, Israel is the only nation in the West that is occupying another people. On the other hand, Israel is the only nation in the West that is existentially threatened. Both occupation and intimidation make the Israeli condition unique. Intimidation and occupation have become the two pillars of our condition. I at least found that to be a helpful lens to look at what's happening, to try to look at it from our perspective, but also appreciate how we might feel about it, frankly, if we were sitting in Israel. I'm not taking a position on any particular action. I'm saying that living out the covenant in this land with the people that are there and have been there apparently since Abraham wandered in. Second World War had a big part of this too, of course. It's hard to figure out what you're supposed to do and how God is calling us to be and how we honor the covenant. But I don't think we can figure out what we're going to do, much less maybe have policy thoughts that if we don't recognize the truth of those two poles, if you will, that existential threat and that existential occupation, not existential, but policy of occupation, right? Those things are existing at the same time. And what do you do about all of that? And this has been going on in that part of the world since these stories in Genesis. So, what does the education of Abraham tell us? I think it tells us that left to our own devices and desires, it's going to be really hard. That we've got to commit ourselves to something higher than ourselves. And that has a cost. Kierkegaard goes on at length about this in his description of the binding of Isaac, right? Committing ourselves to that higher authority has a cost. Obedience has a cost to our ambitions, at least our own ambitions. But it also has a reward in that we believe we're optimists, right? I love saying if it ain't good, it ain't over. We're fundamentally, to be faithful, we're optimists. That God can redeem anything. Anything we do, anything this country does, anything that happens in the Middle East can be redeemed. I'm not saying there's not a lot of cost in the interim. I'm not saying the world survives. I'm just saying there's redemption. That's our fundamental faith, that God can redeem anything. And so I believe that our ethics ought to be motivated by that. We ought to be motivated, as I believe Abraham was motivated, to act for the future. Time and time again, Abraham acts for the future. And over time, he finds, God kind of says, this isn't going to happen to you. When I said you were going to get all the land, I didn't mean you. I meant your people, your descendants, those who follow. So what he is called to do through the covenant, what I think we are called to do in our lives is set the stage for the future to the extent we can. And I think that can be a meaningful guide. All right. Any questions, comments, rebuttals? You've got 3 minutes. Anybody over here while we're waiting on Randy? Okay.
Well, following that theme, there was a lot of pain left. It wasn't all lollipops and butterflies because Isaac and Abraham, one of the things Koss points out, they never had a relationship after that to speak of, because you can imagine if you're the son and going through that. it's going to be pretty rough to trust your dad after that. They didn't go out and play golf. But then the redemption would have been in Jacob, as he is Israel. So it took a while, but it got there.
Yeah, thank you. And while we won't really get to the meat of it here, Kas's treatment of the raising of Isaac, it's like, who's the real carrier of the covenant during that? It's not Isaac, it's his mom. She's the real carrier of the covenant. Maybe we'll look at that a little bit more. Thanks for that. Anything else? Okay. Jake?
I was just curious why you didn't ask if it was obedience or ambition when God asked Abraham to circumcise himself.
Because if that's your ambition, I got nothing to say to you. Yeah. Oh, Lord, I guess you're just recalling our roots as being a Cathedral of St. Philip, aren't you? All right, well, thank you. I know that's a little heavy, but I think that structure is helpful, and I'll keep that in mind as we go through Genesis, and not just in this class, but in the future. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.